Roundtable on civil resistance. How's everyone doing? How's everyone doing this morning? Good? Citizenship and civil disobedience should get a better response than that. How's everyone doing? Good, there we go. Thank you. All right, I want to actually just start before I introduce everyone by taking a quick poll of the audience as people are coming back in and sitting down. I read somewhere that 3% of the American population participated in a protest movement in the last year alone. That's a phenomenal figure. How many people here today have participated in a protest action in the last year? Look at that.
That's beautiful.
That's beautiful. That's part of democracy. Okay. All right, so come on in, come on down, find a seat. My name is Samantha Hill. I'm the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center here at Bard College and visiting Assistant Professor of Political Studies. To my right is Professor Theda Skocpol, who just gave a wonderful keynote, so I'm not going to give you a formal introduction because Professor Rosenblum did that. Directly to my left is Dennis Maloney. He is a retired teacher, supervisor, administrator, and principal of the New York City Board of Education. He's been a resident of Dutchess County here for the past 33 years and active in local politics as an originalist constitutionalist and meets on a regular basis with the Dutchess County Tea Party. To the left of Dennis is Judy Peppinella. Judy has dedicated the last 10 years of her life to the Conservative Society for Action, which she is the founding board member of. She has organized numerous lobbying trips to Washington, D.C. and Albany on behalf of the CSA and attended hundreds of rallies and meetings across the country talking with fellow citizens. Welcome, Judy. To the left of Judy is Kaylee Jane. Kaylee Jane is a founder and executive director of Rise Up Kingston. We're really excited to have so many people here involved in local politics. I just want to say that. Kaylee began, I love this note here, Kaylee. Kaylee began her fight for justice in the 8th grade. In the 8th grade, when she organized a protest against inequitable dress code policies and has been involved in civil disobedience and resistance since then. Welcome. And to the left of Kaylee is Rebecca Salatin. She is an editorial director of Riverhead Books and has been a member of Indivisible Harlem and founder and coordinator of a coalition of Manhattan activist groups focused on regaining democratic control of the New York State Senate. Welcome. So Professor Skocpol raised a lot of interesting points in her keynote, and one of the questions that I think you posed rhetorically in response to Mark Bray, one of the leaders of Antifa who will be speaking later in the conference, was who is the real resistance? And the theme of women, white, middle-class, liberal women, arose in talking about who's organizing within the Tea Party, who's organizing on these social media platforms within the resistance movement. Donald Trump loves to say at his political rallies, "I love women." It's one of his favorite lines, "I love women." And then he likes to throw out the number 52, 52%. We got 52% of the vote. But what that actually means is 52% of white middle-class women voted for Donald Trump. So on the left and on the right, it seems that white middle-class women are doing a lot of the political organizing right now. And I think that would be a nice theme to pick up on, and just generally thinking about who's participating in democracy right now in the United States. So I want to just open the panel by allowing each of our speakers to give a kind of entree into the conversation and tell you a little bit more about the political work they do in response to Professor Skocpol's keynote. Do you want to start, Dennis?
Yes.
Excellent.
Microphone.
You're to my left.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hill. Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Berkowitz, the Hannah Arendt Center staff, esteemed panelists, Bard College faculty, students, and you, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dennis Maloney. I am a retired teacher, supervisor, administrator, and principal with the New York City Board of Education. I have lived in Dutchess County with my lovely wife these past 33 years, raising our 6 children. I have been invited to be a panelist at this conference because it was felt that there should be some local representation with Tea Party affiliation. I am it.
You got Judy right there.
Let me explain. I'm not a member of the Tea Party, as there is no official Tea Party in Dutchess County, rather a loose group of like-minded residents. In fact, as Dr. Scopel correctly points out in her book, there really isn't a monolithic Tea Party member. There are libertarians, conservatives, and constitutionalists, etc. All right, the one thing all of these disparate individuals agree on is a distrust and fear of big government. It is their position that all atrocities against humankind in history were perpetrated by overpowerful governments. Like Hannah Arendt, I too am worried that the rise of a technocratic bureaucracy with a willing media as accomplice and massive private funding influencing an undereducated youthful population to exacerbate an environment of discord and distrust will result in people getting hurt. Today's news is rife with violence breaking out at Berkeley, Portland, Charlottesville, etc. Is this civil disobedience? No, this is thuggery. The European brown shirts of the 1920s and 30s weren't engaged in civil disobedience to effect a peaceful political change. They were intimidating the population so as to allow their backers to seize power. That only happens when there is a powerful central government. That is why the Second Amendment was written into the United States Constitution as the Second Amendment. Not the first, but not the 10th. If civil disobedience is nonviolent and intent on exposing a wrong in order to garner support for a legal or political change, it falls under the First Amendment and is sanctioned. Actions such as the violence that happened at Berkeley and Portland are not protected and should not be condoned and should be prosecuted. The organizers of this conference used the terms civil disobedience and civil resistance interchangeably. I would like a clear definition of each and how specifically they are different. The conference also groups the Tea Party with Antifa, BLM, etc. as engaging in the same activities. This is not true. The Tea Party has never engaged in violent, destructive behavior. I cannot say the same for the others. Finally, I am a citizen of a country that all the peoples of the world want to be a citizen of. The U.S. admits 1 million legal immigrants every year, more than the rest of the world combined. Why do these people endure the hardship of expending their time, labor, and treasure to come? One simple word: freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Okay, this is on. Normally they don't give me a microphone. They tell me I'm so loud I don't need one. It comes from being a mother. That's what comes from being a Girl Scout leader and many years of being on a sports field of my own and with my kids. My name's Judy Peppinella. I'm a co-founder of the Conservative Society for Action. I'm also probably going to get some daggers on this one. The state coordinator for Tea Party Patriots, a very top-down organization, thank you. And I'm not going to disagree with you one word. I am the person who's involved with the bottom-up versions. This is New York State. Nationally, we don't count. Nobody worries about us nationally because as far as they're concerned in on the right side of the equation. It's two left, don't worry about it. It's a blue state, it doesn't matter. Freedom is something everybody should have a right to. It doesn't matter if you agree with me or don't. You should have every darn right to stand up and speak it loud and speak for what you believe in. But as what Dennis said, violence is nothing short of thuggery to me. I firmly believe get up and protest. Speak your mind. The fact that there are students in here and that you're here sitting through this, which could be considered by some kids as, oh my God, I gotta listen to the adults. It's great. You're active with your future. And if you're not active with your future, you won't have a future. We don't have to agree, but we must respect each other, and civility is necessary. And I thank you for saying that. You mentioned certain things regarding what the Tea Party, most of the people are upset with immigration. The organization that I'm with we have 6,000 members. We would have meetings with 250 people at the meetings. We no longer have meetings per se as we did back in the beginning, where we talked about tactics, things to do, what to do. Our members have gotten involved civically, civic associations. Our groups go to legislative meetings, town board meetings, school board meetings, library board meetings, every single level. The most important thing is effective political action. And I'm throwing out terms. I can answer questions what that means on both sides of the conversation. But that's basically what we do, and that's what most of the New York groups do. Again, national groups don't see us. We're New York, you're over there, New York, forget that. But we have to stand up for New York. We don't have to, I'll say it again and again and again. We don't have to agree, but we have to remember at the end of the day, we are all residents of this state. We are all people that live here. We have to have a give and take. We must have civil disobedience, but responsible, respectful conversations. And that's what I think is missing on both sides, and that needs to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Hey, everyone. My name is Callie Jane. I am a community organizer, I think, first and foremost, but yes, founder and executive director of Rise Up Kingston. And we're a grassroots organization that's led by low-income people and people of color that's fighting to dismantle racism and oppression and capitalism, all the little things, in order to build a local economy that is based on all of our needs, focusing on the liberation, the true liberation of all people. And I feel like there's an important clarification I just want to start with, that I am not a part of the anti-Trump resistance. The anti-Trump resistance is something that has been created very, very recently. Trump was not the cause of the problems. Trump is a result of the problems that have been happening for a very long time. And I feel that the anti-Trump resistance and the indivisible movements that went along with it, although it was a great way to funnel a lot of people into things, was very much centered on white feminism. And I also really feel the need to bring up, there's something right here in our book that says we are not focusing on that. One of the problems of these movements is that we're not focusing on the future. And I just need to push back and make sure, and I want to see who in this room has read the Black Lives Matter policy platform. Yeah, we need to read exactly what you said. Because, when we talk about resistance, in this moment, we are talking about a certain type of resistance. But in 2012, when Trayvon Martin was killed, and in 2013, when his murderer was acquitted, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullins, Opal Tometi, a whole bunch of other Black organizers created an organization starting with a love note to Black people, where the hashtag Black Lives Matter went viral and continued to move forward. In 2014, when Michael Brown was murdered, Black Lives Matter got national attention. And that national attention actually caused Palestinians to tweet about how to deal with tear gas, which really brought up this connection between Israeli armed forces and the police in the United States. And so when we talk about this, the moving towards a vision, absolutely. We have spent so long fighting against things that we are not fighting for anything anymore. And the Black Lives Matter platform exists, has been around since 2016, and has concrete policy changes that we could do to make things better and more just. Most of America is not ready for it yet. The other thing that I really just need to just point out is, we've talked a lot about this conflict of values here, differences of opinion. The conflict of values tends to be a fear of loss of power from one side and a fear of loss of freedom from the other side. And I can't say that that's the same thing. Most people, as we say, are threatened by the new demographics. And we're not even talking about Columbus coming in and slaughtering a whole bunch of people and stealing land. So we have to really start there. It's challenging as a community organizer to try to have a conversation with somebody whose values are rooted in the oppression of others. But it is an important thing that we can start to do. And as we talk about violence, and we talk about civil disobedience, it is our responsibility to fight against unjust policies and unjust laws, and whatever we need to do in order for that to happen, I think is necessary. There's fundamental differences in what we are talking about in terms of our push to engage on the ground. If you are organizing for the control of somebody else, that is not okay. And there's been violence against Black and brown bodies for a very, very long time, and violence will bring more violence, and we know that. Now, I am not saying that I am a violent person, but I'm saying that we can't rule out something when we have violence against bodies, people being killed in the street, extrajudicial murders of Black and brown folks happening every single day. And the Black Lives Matter platform is based on the experience of a low-income transgender person of color, because we are not free until we are all free. And I think that's a big thing that we really have to talk about. Martin Luther King Jr. said that nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks so to dramatize the issue that it can no longer be ignored. And that's what civil disobedience is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
I'm as my name tag says, I'm an editor and an essayist, but I'm actually, as described, an editor and a member of Indivisible Harlem. And the only thing I have written for publication, actually one of the couple of things I've written for publication to date, is an op-ed inspired by my activism. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of my particular trajectory, because I am in many ways typical of the women that Theda talked about, even though I am urban. I'm from New York City, and I am, in my personal politics, are to the left of what Theda describes as the politics of the overall resistance. But despite the fact that I'm an urbanite, my trajectory is very much like the people that she describes. I grew up in an activist family in Texas, primarily, where I was so put off by repeated defeat in every election we worked in, and had sort of a PTSD about that I was not inspired much to take it up in adult life. Although I voted, I was a good citizen in that sense. I was not optimistic about the outcome of this election, partly because in my day job I edit people like Masha Gessen, whose work many of you may be familiar with, and I had a bad feeling about the way things were going, and I began to, I also went to see my mother in Texas, who had Hillary Clinton signs on her lawn and is 90 and deaf and can't go door to door, and felt bad about it. And felt bad about the fact that she was too deaf to make phone calls anymore, and I felt there was absolutely no excuse for my inaction, even at that late date. So, and I had the feeling that if Trump won, I did not want to feel as if I had not done what was in my power to prevent that from happening. So I answered the call of a friend of mine who comes from the Reading, Pennsylvania area, and I began to canvass there on weekends as much as I possibly could. And I came out of that feeling I definitely wanted to continue that kind of activism. on-the-ground kind of activism, but I didn't feel so great about working in a place where I didn't live. I didn't feel like I had the right to tell people in Pennsylvania, desperately poor people, a very, very poor city, Reading, what they should be doing or why they should be doing it. So after the election, I had that sense of, well, okay, my congressman is Jerry Nadler, and I have Chuck Schumer and Kristen Gillibrand. What exactly am I was almost envious of my friends in New York State. You can register at your second home. People who had second homes or lived up here who had FASO to fight. And then one of the interesting things about being in the grassroots is that awareness began to seep through almost week by week through little groups. I punched in my zip code into the Indivisible directory, found a place near me, shopped a couple of groups. Population is dense in New York, so there were a lot of groups. Found a group that felt copacetic, and around, say, January, February, after the election, this name, the IDC, began to surface all over the place, and people like me, nobody I knew what it was. And by digging and talking to people who were politically active and did understand, there's a weird thing in New York State, which if you are New York State residents and voters, you should be aware of, which is that the biggest problem is actually we were not in a blue state from my standpoint. It turns out that although the assembly in this state is overwhelmingly Democratic leaning, the Senate has always been neck and neck, and although the New York State Senate was won for the Democrats by a one-seat majority in the last election, there was this breakaway group of Democrats who refused to conference with the mainline Democrats and literally handed control of the New York State Senate to the Republicans, something that almost no one I knew knew. So this became the thing. I'm a pragmatic person. I like solvable problems, and I really wanted to work locally. It was clear to me that this is where I would work. So that's where I devoted my energies with my group, and in May following the election, there was the first, it was citywide, but actually statewide group of umbrella organizations met to talk about this issue, and I came away from that both exhilarated and absolutely overwhelmed by the lack of money, the lack of infrastructure, et cetera. And I could see from going to the protests that I've been going to that there were other groups just like us out there. We literally met that way, very much in the way that Theta describes. Action Potluck, they weren't all Indivisibles by name. Action Potluck, Inwood Indivisible, et cetera. And we met up with each other, and I thought we do not have the resources to all be doing the same thing. We need to cooperate. We need to share the labor of the things that we're writing. We need to coordinate to a degree. So I made my own personal task, which was over that summer, to form a loose coalition of groups and that were working on this IDC issue, particularly in Manhattan, where, by the way, 6 of these 8 members of this coalition are in New York City. Were in New York City. We were successful in that effort. We managed to defeat 6 of the 8 of them, which was double what we thought we would be able to do, and also often with a 10th of the head of the IDC was taken down, much as Ocasio-Cortez won with a 10th of her opponent's funding. The head of the IDC was taken down by Alexandra Biaggi with a 10th of the funding that Jeff Klein, the head of the IDC, had. Now, of course, we've turned our attention to the midterm elections, and we're working very hard on Senate races and carrying in this experience that we've had learning to talk to people, to explain a complicated issue. I concentrated on the Upper West Side, which had the weird but very helpful problem of being a place almost entirely made of co-op buildings in a very affluent part of the city. You can't get into co-op buildings to knock door to door, so we found ways with the help of Bed Bath & Beyond $20 tables and signs that said, if you live on this block, your state senator is a Trump Democrat. We got out there and we talked to people, and that's been great practice for what we're going into now.
Thank you. Would you like to respond, Theta?
Well, I just enjoyed hearing the comments from everyone. And one point I will make is that both the grassroots Tea Party organizing and the grassroots groups that have organized since, and the ones that were already there that are doing more, I've been amazed at how much people have learned about the complexities of American government. And that is definitely a commonality. This is a confusing system. It's a federated system. Many people live in places where their representatives are divided. I mean, the natural community isn't represented by one person. And there's all the different levels. And, you know, figuring out that you need to go to local boards, that you need to go to local meetings, that you need to elect people at all those levels, that the state legislature may be processing things one way and the Congress another way. Both the Tea Party and all the groups that are active now, I think, are teaching people a lot about those things. It tells you something that probably teaching works better when there's activity connected to it. Because I don't know whether they cover this stuff in school anymore, but even if they do, the mind glazes over unless you need it. So that's a remarkable. And I'm glad you reminded people that, yeah, you may be right that the National Tea Party organizers are ignoring you here in New York, but New York is not all liberal. There's lots of non-liberal people and lots of non-liberal representatives in this vast state, just like there are in most places. And so there's plenty to organize around.
Does anyone want to pick up? Or one of the questions that I was thinking about as everyone was talking is what is happening to our political party system right now in the United States? I think it's incredible that everyone on the stage, and many of you raised your hands in the audience, are active in politics in one way or another, involved in local community organizing. And so right now within the Democratic Party, at least, we're seeing the rise of social democratic candidates like Ocasio-Cortez that Rebecca mentioned, but we're also seeing the return of blue dog Democrats like Connor Lamb in the South. And I'm wondering to what extent...
Connor Lamb is not a blue dog Democrat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know blue dog Democrats, and he's not one.
Well, I trust you on that, but we're seeing the return of more moderate or conservative Democrats on social questions. And so I'm wondering, there's this kind of there's this underlying feeling of urgency, of crisis in the United States right now that often gives way to a feeling of malaise. And I'm just wondering if anyone up here would like to respond, and if you would like to talk about what's happening to the Democratic and Republican Party and how that's motivating people to get more involved in politics at the local level.
As a registered Republican, I think my party stinks. I might shock all of you to hear that. They are, well, thank you. The reason I say that is the same reason I say, and again, I say don't shoot me on this statement, the Democratic Party stinks. And the reason I say that is simple. They're all about controlling what they want for themselves, and everyone in this room does not matter. If you have an issue and you want to bring it up to the party people, they're like, yeah, sure, whatever. You want to run for office? If you don't have time in their pocket, in other words, you're not their volunteer, you're not their gopher, you're not going to get put up for an election. I can tell you way too many people that I know stood up and said, I want to run for office. And they're like, oh, that's great, congratulations. How much money have you got? That's the first question. Not what's your platform, how much money have you got? Not what's your goal, it's money. And are you going to be loyal to me? I mean the party, excuse me? The reason you get into office is to represent everybody, both sides of the conversation and everything in the middle. That's not what we're seeing in government today. Okay, we have what I call them and us. And I'm not meaning the left and the right on the stage up here. I'm meaning them, those in control, those that will not give a hoot about you and I and our beliefs, whether they're different, doesn't matter. And then the us is the people that are getting their stuff poured down our throats, normally with the heel of somebody's shoe. So activism is imperative. The parties are ridiculous. They're all about control, keeping their jobs, keeping their control, endorsing their people, their thoughts, their principles. And by no means, in my opinion, are doing what is correct for the 98% of the people that are out there. I mean, I won't say 1% because then I'm quoting another group, but I'll give it 2% to be polite, 1% of each group. But that's it. So the parties, they're ridiculous. You had mentioned about the parties with the GOP and the Tea Party. Our organization, Conservative Society for Action, started in 2008. Technically, it's 10 years this month. We started out because we were so sick of what George W. Bush did. We were outraged. We were concerned as the advent of what was going to happen in the election. I'm a businesswoman. I would do sales and marketing, and everybody stopped buying advertising because they didn't know what the economy was going to be like in 2008 with a new president. So everybody rolled back. So my business 50% dropped in 2007. That's just my own little world. But I went over to the local GOP. I said, what are you guys doing? Are you getting involved in 2009 in the Tea Party? And they're like, oh, you're a Tea Partier. That's so nice. You over there, come over here, let's talk. They just shunned us off. It took the 2010 elections for them to start looking at us. And after the election, our boots on the ground, and this is something I say either side of the conversation, because this is important. Again, I say that openly. Don't expect the party to come back and say thank you for the help that you put forth, because they still want their control, and you're just a minion doing their doing and bidding. And I know that's a horrible thing to say, but time and time again, 2010, we worked our tails off to get certain people elected. We were relegated to the back of the room, the back of the aisle, and we weren't talked to until they needed us again. Can you come out and volunteer? So be an activist, stay an activist, and don't expect the party to like you, and don't expect much from them.
Rebecca Garrett.
Well, it's complicated in New York State, certainly, with the relationship between the Democratic Party and the grassroots. Our great blessing is that we are poor. We have no money from the state. We aren't operating within the state party lines, and that gives us tremendous freedom. Our governor, more than arguably, liked that situation of division in the state Senate. It has allowed him to claim progressive credentials and not have to fork over political capital or spend money on things he didn't want to spend money on. But it's not an either-or thing. It has been essential to organizing to get to understand, deeply understand, and figure out how to participate in democratic politics if we're going to have, I'm with Ed on this, the vote matters. Yes. We're only going to affect this if we get people elected that we need to get elected. So, just in really basic way, and in New York it's not all one thing. The system is partly atrophied, heavily corrupt. It's a lot of different things at the same time. So as just a small instance, one of the very first things that we did in our Indivisible group is made contact with a really interesting group in New York City, you may know, is run, the Democratic clubs are modeled on, and the system is largely modeled on it's the old Tammany system. It's an ancient system. Chicago does it and probably does it better still. But I got two people from a political club just north of us, West Harlem Progressive Dems, who had basically taken over a defunct Democratic club to come in and talk to us for 2 hours about the structure of the party system and the history of the club and party system in New York State. It's essential to know those things. Right now, not quite right now, because right now we're focused on the midterms, but I can see that coming up, we're going to have to figure out to what extent we want to participate in that, or whether we want to continue to do what I think our instincts are leading us toward, which is to form a kind of an alternate kind of a structure. We're going to participate in democratic politics, don't get me wrong, electoral politics are very important to us, but do we want to just buy into this, or do we want to continue to be sort of ungovernably outside of it? And I think our inclination is toward the latter.
So it's interesting. So I hate politics. I'm just going to say that. I think that electoral politics has taken up a lot of control and our focus. Where for certain months out of the year, suddenly we want to talk to everyone in the community. Yet, like you said, we've ignored them the majority of the time. And I am Working Families Party. I'm a registered Working Families Party person right now. Although I can say I feel certain types of way about what's happening there too. But I have hired people before, and I never hire them and then wait 2 years and check back in and say, how'd it go? And that is what we are doing in politics right now. We are deciding that somebody else gets to make every single decision for us for the next 2 years, and that's not okay. And so even when we fight and we say, okay, we got to get the Democrats in, or there might be one side, any blue won't do, there's all these different things that we're talking about. But in reality, we have to think about the issues. We have to think about what our vision is for a world and move towards that. And right now, we're just at this point where we are pushing so hard against all the horrible things that are happening that we consider it a win to not die. We literally said, we did not die today, congratulations. We leveled up one more day. And that's not actually gonna move us places. So bringing it back to your initial question about the parties, as long as we keep looking at it and we keep saying, from this perspective, a perspective of quasi-justice, that the Democratic Party is the party that has the justice in mind, and therefore whatever they want to do, at least it's not this other thing. We are going to be fighting against this other thing for a very, very long time if we don't push and say, no, we need something that is centered on, like the Black Lives Matter platform, low-income, transgender, people of color, and those experiences. Because in reality, all of the parties and all of the decisions and all of the policies are influenced by greed. It is influenced by capitalism. It is influenced by a desire to have this power over others. And so it doesn't matter who we elect. Sometimes it really doesn't matter who we elect if we are not also going to stand up and fight for the things that we need. And so our Democratic Party isn't going to save us. The people need to save the Democratic Party in reality. And we need to look towards more, we need to look towards goals, and we need to figure out how do we actually change the systems, because right now our two-party system is allowing us to just fight. In 2008 it was, oh my God, there's a black guy, let's fight. And now it's, oh my God, there's this guy who's grabbing women by the And in reality, we are not actually standing up and saying, this is what I want the world to look like, let me organize and act accordingly and strategically up to that point. We're being reactive, not proactive.
In line with that, in 2008, when the Tea Party formed, it was because an awful lot of Republicans had come to the conclusion that the Republican Party was moving so far left that it was moving into the area of bigger and bigger government. The grassroots have a problem with that. So when they formed the Tea Party, they didn't just go to town halls of Democrats and disrupt it. They went to town halls of Republicans and disrupted, especially any that were advocating toward bigger government, okay? I think we all of us on this stage and everyone here, we're all concerned about the welfare of the American state and population. We differ on how we get there. The Tea Party is concerned about big government. This is a very serious concern. As I said earlier, read your history. It's never a weak government that subjects its people. That's the concern, all right? So the Tea Party was moved and did the only logical thing it could. It moved with the one party that was closest to their concept of what government should be, and they tried to change the Republican Party to move further to the smaller government concept.
Thank you.
I'm fascinated to hear all of these comments. I will say that in our research on the Tea Party, we certainly found that skepticism about the Republican Party, I would say even more than you find among many of the grassroots resistance groups now, although our panelist here has expressed a lot of skepticism about the Democratic Party. But small government is not exactly what we found. What we found was that people wanted less government for them, and without And the biggest part of American government is military and veteran spending, Social Security, and Medicare. And out of all the Tea Party people I met and interviewed, I only found a 10th who wanted to cut those things. So the research suggests that neither political party nor right or left movements over the last 75 years have cut the size of American government. They've redirected it, but they haven't cut it. And it's not that easy to cut because actually Americans of all stripes, and I don't mean just color, I also mean class, background, get benefits from government in one way or another that they are likely to fight for, particularly when they're threatened. And even the tax cut movement, which is a big deal, it cuts the taxes but doesn't cut the spending. So, and we're seeing that once again. So I'll just express a little bit of skepticism about that, but let me say something about political parties. It's a mistake to think that either the Democrats or the Republicans are all one thing. And I think that there's a great deal of variety and complexity in the relationship of extra-party citizens organizations and social movement organizations and the political parties, particularly if you're thinking about the political parties as organizations that do things beyond just election campaigns. And one of the things that's a current part of our research in the 8 counties, which I'm finding absolutely fascinating, is to try to figure out what local political parties actually are and what they do. And the patterns, we've launched another round of study about that, and we're going beyond just looking at parties as election results or just as voter IDs and surveys, but who's actually, is there an office? Is there somebody there? Are there events all year, not just during election times? How do they relate to the local Tea Party if they're Republicans? How do they relate to various extra party groups if they're Democrats? And boy, you know, it's not one story at all. There's a great deal of variety. And the 2 local Tea Parties that are still meeting in the counties I'm visiting, and I've had the privilege of meeting their leaders and hearing from them, getting to know them, they have, I would say, tense cooperative relations with their local Republicans. Tenser in one place than in the other. And but in some other places, they've literally taken over the local party. And I think we're going to see the same thing among these resistors, because in some cases, they're doing the same thing I saw Tea Partiers doing 8 years ago. They're studying up on the local rules, and they're turning up at a meeting and voting the guys out. They're just voting them out. And imagine how startled the Chamber of Commerce Republicans were to see the Tea Party people arriving to vote them out. And often the Tea Party people didn't look the same. They weren't in suits. One guy told me, they meet at the country club, we meet at the Golden Corral. And, you know, that's exactly the difference in that place. I think the same kind of pattern has already unfolded in Pennsylvania. And we are, by the way, studying local groups in liberal urban areas as well as smaller places. So the whole gamut. And in some places, they're literally voting, they're voting to fill precinct offices that were empty, and they're voting out the county party chairs and putting in somebody else, but without collapsing into them. And that's the final thought I want to leave you all with. I think there's a strong tendency to think it's either top down or bottom up. It's either inside or outside in relation to the parties. Political change happens, and you're talking to somebody who's been studying political change for 50 years. It's getting on now. And I studied actual revolutions, the French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions. What's happening here is not an actual revolution. And a good thing, too, because actual revolutions never turn out the way the revolutionaries want them to. We're talking about radical reform, but all kinds of political change happens most effectively through parallel, intertwined organization, not through things collapsed into each other. So the formula for making Democrats and Republicans more responsive is to have organized citizens and movements alongside them that interact with them and overlap with them, but don't collapse into them. And I think we're seeing that on both sides now in in American politics.
Thank you. I want to.
Can I ask one question?
Okay, but then I want to open it up to the audience for questions since we're running
Not
out of
just
time.
in response.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you made mention that when it comes to spending, Tea Partiers are not particularly big on cutting things like Social Security, Medicare, and so forth.
The things that the government spends
However,
the most on.
haven't they come up with an alternative in privatization that drives everybody else crazy?
Such as?
Well,
Privatization is, by the way, often more expensive.
it may be, but if the individual citizen, for example, in New York City, which I know, up until the last 2 or 3 decades of the 20th century, a lot of city employees did not have to buy into Social Security. They bought into their union endowments.
Yeah, that's true.
And in many cases, they did much better than the people in Social Security.
Yeah, in lots of places they do much worse as well. So, but I mean, you know, look, I'm not
But
saying
hasn't
it's the
that
same
been raised?
everywhere, but I do want to say that privatization often spends more taxpayer money than direct public provision. Now, there may be reasons why direct public provision can become bureaucratically sclerotic. And New York and Massachusetts are good examples of a lot of bureaucratic sclerosis. So you're not going to find me arguing about that. But the idea of spending taxpayer money, I don't know any political force in America
Is it necessary?
that is really cutting down
sorry.
on spending taxpayer money. They're cutting down on collecting the taxes to pay for the taxpayer money, but they're paying, whether they're building up debt.
But-
And that's a very old American story in America. Americans have always been willing to take taxpayer money.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience and then let our panelists respond to this conversation while including the. Can we take a couple questions and then respond all together since we only have about 5 minutes left. So, Amy, in the pink here, Willem. Can you stand up, please, and introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks. I'm Amy Schiller from the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research. So I'm going to ask my question as somebody who was raised in Ohio and worked on campaigns in Ohio, Democratic campaigns. My parents are still active in Ohio politics, and I think my concern watching how they're going about and how campaigns I've worked on in the Democratic Party have gone about their approach to statewide politics is I actually have a concern that at some point, I think pursuant to Callie's point, pragmatism is at odds with strong coalition building. Like one thing that I hear from Judy in particular, as well as Dennis, is this confluence of like a strong ideological vision with like very clear tactics. There's like ideological clarity and there's tactical clarity intertwined. In Ohio, for example, what I see is let's get the least offensive statewide Democratic candidate to run because it feels the least risky, as opposed to somebody who is advancing a more ambitious vision. And of course, these things are modified to their local context, but I think what I felt concerned about was the ongoing viability of political movements that are rooted in pragmatism, as Dr. Scotchpole has been describing, and versus like ones like the Tea Party that have their tactics that are rooted in a much clearer and stronger kind of ideological agenda and pull.
I don't think so.
So my question is, like, at what point will pragmatism undermine sort of radical political movement, is particularly on the left?
Thank you.
So the first thing I want to say to that, to many of you who know the name, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I want you to know the Working Families Party did not endorse her in the primary because they didn't think it was possible, okay? And so that's the type of pragmatism that, like we're saying, let's strategically figure something out, but we can't actually stand up. And we live in this place right now where instead of working alongside of each other, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are not listening to those on the ground. So I want to just speak about the Democratic Party piece of it for a minute. There are people, there are groups. Black Lives Matter is not the only one that has strategy, that has a platform, that has suggestions, that has policies. And there are so many people who do not want to listen because they do not value those with a lived experience that could actually answer the questions and solve the problems. And so, it's hard to think about, these big pictures of, how do we break out of this two-party system? How can we change things? But I think that we really have to look at listening to folks on the ground and letting those organizers lead instead of allowing the Democratic Party to make the decisions of how we all move forward, and then us jumping in line because we feel like, well, we might as well do that. And so we're not going to have longevity. We're just going to keep doing this back and forth where we, rise up and then break down and then rise up all over again if we don't actually strategically put forth a plan of where we want to be. And I think that the Democratic Party is, in my experience, has lacked that. They are not inclusive. I 2 years ago was invited to, Democratic Party lobster bakes, and that was their meeting. And I had people shaking their fingers in my face and say, well, the black folks never come out. I said, well, I'm not going to your lobster bake at your country club. Let's have a real conversation. And the fact that we are still trying to change the minds of people who are trying to oppress others and take rights away from others instead of trying to talk to the people who don't show up to the polls is disgusting to me. That means you have better faith and more faith in changing the mind of somebody who is racist and oppressive than actually having a conversation with somebody who believes what you believe and is impacted by things but has a lot of different barriers to being involved. And so the Democratic Party is not going to move forward or be sustainable, and it's going to continue struggling until it starts focusing its efforts on the people who are traditionally excluded, who have all the answers, solutions to the problems because they live it.
Why don't we take 2 more questions? We'll take them together, and then do you want to respond?
Well, I just want to say I don't think there
is.
is any such thing as the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And I'm not going to question your experience in New York, but there are plenty of Democrats who are progressives and who are running, and there are plenty of Democrats who are reaching out and mobilizing minority groups. It's
Because they need the votes or because they care?
Huh?
Because they need the votes or because they care? And want to change their lives and want to make direct, lasting changes in these lives.
That what matters in politics is amassing the resources and the votes to win office and then being held either by your own sincere beliefs or by citizens groups who hold you responsible for carrying through the changes you can carry through. In the end, sincerity doesn't matter if people act right.
So I believe the question of civility has really just been thrown down. Let's take 2 more questions together, and then, so Larry in the middle here, Willem, and then are there any students? Are there any students with their hands up? And the young lady in the back with her hand up after that. Please keep your questions brief. The microphone. Willem, can you get the microphone, please?
I'm Larry Galata, and I actually live in Brooklyn, born in Brooklyn, and was the president of the local Democratic Party club in my assembly district for 2.5 years. And I was employed by government for 35 years and recently retired. You have been employed by government for many, many decades. How does your employment in government, the Board of Ed, a very large bureaucracy, square with your Tea Party small government philosophies?
Thank you. And Willem, can we get the question from with their hand up back there, please? The microphone.
So I guess I will start with, first of all, you accused me of not having strength earlier because I was, I don't know what word to use, but I was criticizing your talk verbally during your talk. And you're probably right, I don't have strength. I don't know what to think. I'm just a 17-year-old. I don't have all the answers. And what I do know is that the Libertarian Party and the right-wing anarcho-capitalist people have done an exceptional job of co-opting anarchist rhetoric and of co-opting the idea of small government as, actually one point that you raised that I do agree with for once is that they're not really talking about the military at all when that is the largest spending of the US government. And I guess, Callie, I have a question for you. You mentioned something about, you said something about unjust laws, fighting against unjust laws. I guess my question is, I don't think there are any laws that are just, that the entire legal system is formed in such a way to keep the status quo in power, and that status quo is white male, as opposed to what the Tea Party people might claim. And I guess I'm just questioning, the efficacy of, we were talking about violence earlier, and I'm just questioning the efficacy of tactics that are permitted by the state, that are seen as permissible, only when it comes to certain people, of course, not always, as you often see. And when that guy called them thugs, that was one of the examples of how certain tactics for certain people are seen as unacceptable. So I think I want to question, is it a function of privilege to claim nonviolence as the ultimate tactic because our voices are listened to?
Thank you. Why don't we quickly wrap up? Everyone can just briefly respond, and then we will move to lunch.
I was going to
Dennis.
respond to the Board of Ed. The New York City Board of Ed is a massive piece of work. Its budget now is somewhere in the neighborhood of close to $40 billion. It has God knows how many, well over 1 million children, and teachers, maybe 150,000 of them. How would the Tea Party react to that? The Tea Party would be very pro-local control, away from things like Common Core. Let each school district of the 32, I believe, that are in the New York City Board of Ed, let them run their own show. However, you would have to return to the New York State Department of Education, resuming its primary function, which is to oversee the quality of education through New York State. It used to do that through the Regents exams. You could still keep the Central Board of Education to provide central services, such as screening teachers, et cetera, but the control of the actual day-to-day operation should be at each of the school district level, okay? I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. No, sorry. This conversation can continue, but let's wrap up the panel.
So I'll respond to the question, short answer, yes. You must have some level of privilege in order to say that nonviolence is the way, or that blocking a road is not the way to do things, or that standing up and shouting is not the way to do things, because I could walk outside of my house and be shot, killed on video camera, and the cop could go and get another job someplace else if he even got fired, okay? And so it is not just physical violence, it is the economic violence, it is the education violence, it is the power dynamic. Those in power currently are committing violence against communities every single day who are then told to be nice, who are then told that they cannot disrupt. And when we blocked a road just very, very, very recently, we saw the entire spectrum of people. The I'm totally with you, but I gotta get to an appointment. Can you just block? And the I would run you down crowd. And we see all these people, and I need everyone to understand that violence will bring more violence, and violence has been committed against black and brown bodies as long as we have existed, and the indigenous body. Violence is being pushed against people, and now when we stand up, then all of a sudden everyone's saying, well, wait, not violence, we can't do it that way. So yes, you must have privilege because our laws are unjust, and loitering as a white person is different than loitering as a brown person.
Thank you.
You know, I want to say something about the violence question, but I'm going to define the word violence as bodily harm and killing people. Now, it's absolutely the case that there's a very serious problem of disproportionate use of police force against people of color in this country. Also lower income people of any color. But it's not either or, whether protest or voting are the solutions to that. Because voting in new local governments that will put in new police practices is an important part of the answer. And that can't be done if people don't vote. So protesting, by all means. Voting, for sure. And on the question of whether violence in that physical sense is likely to help those who are oppressed, I think history teaches us otherwise. If people start shooting at police officers, and that's happened in a few instances, just randomly, whether or not the particular police officer is doing anything, the result will be more deaths among the minorities and those who are, and less reform. And so I actually think it's a moral question. I happen to believe that no democracy can flourish, small d, democracy can flourish if people use violent means. So I think a modicum of government control and fair government that protects all citizens is a sine qua non for a democratic political system. But, and I've studied actual revolutions, and they never turn out well. So what we're about here in this country is radical reform, and we have to do it by organizing, arguing, voting, and protesting, not by killing each other.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our roundtable for this exciting conversation. I want to just make a couple quick announcements. If you want, we have 3 breakout sessions going on during lunch, which starts right now. So if you want to continue this conversation